up to this point we've been talking about simple triads, 3-note chords. Now we're going to sort of take the next step, the next big leap, and we're going to add another note which is going to give us a 4-note chord. So let's go back and review. Basically, when you build a triad, you take a root like middle C, you add a third, you stack on another third. Remember, that's like our meat, cheese, and bun. Now we're going to add another third above that. So we've got root, third, fifth. We're going to add the 7th, and we're going to talk about 7th chords. So really, this is kind of like, you know, we're adding the tomato to our burger, to our meat, cheese, and bun. Now, the thing about adding 7ths is it doesn't really change the function of the chord. So if you're starting to identify the personalities like we talked about, the 7th isn't going to change the function. If anything, it just sort of enhances it, just the way the tomato enhances the burger, right? It still tastes like a burger, but it's just got this little additional thing. Now, just like triads, you know, we built triads on every note of the major scale. If you look in your workbook, you can build 7th chords on every note of the major scale. So we're building it on the C, on the 1, but you can walk right up. So that's the 7th chords on every note of the major scale. Now, there's basically 3 different types of 7th chords. I mean, there are some others, but the 3 that you run into all the time would be these. There's the major 7th chord, the minor 7th chord, and one that's called the dominant 7th chord. So let's look at how each one of these are built. When you take a major triad like C, and you add the 7th, which is B, that's a major 7th chord. Now, the reason it's called a major 7th chord, that name is kind of a shorthand. And I'll show you how this shorthand works. But if you were going to give the full name, like I'm James Thomas Brooks, right? So nobody calls me James Thomas Brooks other than maybe the DMV and the IRS. Everybody calls me Tom. Well, when we name 7th chords, we do the same thing. We don't give the full name just because it takes too long. If I was going to give the full name of this chord, I'd have to call it C major, major 7th, C major, major 7th, because I have to identify the triad as major, and I have to identify the 7th. So you notice that chart in your book right here where it says the full name of a 7th chord is the root, quality of the chord, quality of the 7th, and even in some jazz chords, any variation of the 5th possibly. So there's 4 elements, but I'm just giving you the shorthand name. So you've got major 7th. Now let's move up a key and let's build it on D now. So we're building it on the 2nd degree of the scale. You know that D is a minor chord. We're in the key of C now, so D is going to be minor. Root, 3rd, 5th. We add a 7th. That 7th is a minor 7th. So we have D, the root, minor triad, minor 7th. So D minor, minor 7th. The shorthand for this chord is D minor 7th. So in other words, if the chord and the 7th are the same, C major, major, D minor, minor, you don't say it twice, you just say it once. So this covers several of the chords in the key of C. Here's C with its major 7th, D with its minor 7th, E minor with its minor 7th, F major with its major 7th. I'm going to skip G for right now. A minor with its minor 7th. So that covers everything except for G and B. Now let's go back and talk about G for a second. This is an interesting chord. Think with me for a second. If you build a triad on G, it's a major triad. It's one of the 3 primary triads, right? There's your G triad. Now, if you add the 7th on top of that, that's a minor 7th. So you've got a G major triad and a G minor 7th. So if you're saying the longhand name, you would say G major minor 7th chord, right? Make sense? Well, nobody really calls it that. The name that we use for this chord is called a G dominant 7th chord. Now, the term dominant can be really confusing because it's used 2 different ways in music. The dominant 7th is this particular structure. In other words, you can think of, if you looked in the music dictionary, definition 1 of dominant would be shorthand for a major minor 7th chord, right? So G major triad, minor seventh. That's instead of a G major minor seventh, that's a G dominant seventh. Now what the word dominant means, dominant refers to the fifth degree of the scale. That's the other definition. So in other words, here's C. If you're using those theory terms, tonic, supertonic, mediant, subdominant, dominant. So 5 is the dominant. So you could hear somebody say, play me a dominant chord. If I'm in the key of C, I'm going to play them a G chord. But if they say, play a dominant seventh on, pick any note, play a dominant seventh on E, I'm going to play an E major with a minor seventh. See the difference? It's a little confusing. Look in your workbook and that definition is spelled out there. So those are the three types of seventh chords you're going to run into. Major seventh, which is a major major seventh, minor seventh, which is a minor minor seventh, and dominant seventh, which is a major triad with a minor seventh. Now bear in mind, we're building these all on the key of C on the scale tones using just the white notes. Now you can build any of these chords on any note, right? But any place else you're going to have to use some of the black keys. And for instance, if you were going to use one of those other chords in the key of C, you'd have to use an accidental to change it. But again, there's a great chart in there that shows you the triads and the sevenths, the longhand name and the shorthand name, so you can kind of get a grasp on how the seventh chord works. Now, there are a couple of other seventh chords I want to tell you about. You don't run into these very often, but I just want to put them in your mind so you know. You know, we're basing our seventh chords off major triads and minor triads. The one we didn't talk about is the diminished triad. So let's go to the note B. We're in the key of C now, right? Here's C. The note B, that's the only diminished triad you ever run into in the key of C. Right? And you don't run into it very often, but sometimes you do. And on top of that diminished triad, now in the key of C, if you add the seventh, it's a minor seventh. So the longhand name for that one is B diminished minor seventh. Now you're much more likely to hear this shorthand name. Sometimes that's called E minor 7 flat 5. That's what the jazz guys would call it normally. And you can see why. If you took a B minor 7th and you flatted the 5, lowered the 5, you get the chord we're talking about, B minor 7 flat 5. Another name that you hear is B half diminished. It's called half diminished because only the triad part of it is diminished, right? So B half diminished, B minor 7 flat 5, two names for exactly the same thing. Now, one other variation there, which actually may be more familiar to you, is what they call the full diminished seventh chord. The longhand name would be B diminished diminished seventh. Again, just to avoid confusion, normally people would refer to it as B full diminished to differentiate from half diminished. But what that is a diminished triad with a diminished seventh. Now this doesn't exist in the diatonic key of C. You have to take your B diminished, there's your minor 7, lower it a half step, and there you've got a B full diminished seventh. Now this is your basic creepy, scary chord, right? When you think of, you know, here's the full diminished seventh chord. Played in every carnival spook house in the world, right? So now you do run into that in some other places. Think about, let's stay in the key of C. Let's think of the song, Yesterday, all my troubles seem so far away. There's a B diminished chord. Here's C, yesterday. That's what it sounds like. All my troubles seem so far away. So you do run into these diminished seventh chords occasionally, not real often. But those are two that you might run into. B half diminished and B full diminished. Look in the workbook and be sure you have that distinction really clear.